Welcome to Mystery Manor Tales. I'm your host, Elias Thorne. If you're new here, we specialize in cozy classic mysteries to unwind with, perfect for a cup of tea on a rainy evening. Today we're diving into an original tale inspired by the Queen of Crime herself, Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot, and the Doctor's Dilemma. Settle in, dear listeners, this is a long one. Over 90 minutes of intrigue, deduction, and those little grey cells at work. We'll follow the meticulous Hercule Poirot through a locked-room puzzle on a foggy English estate in the 1920s. Chapter 1. The invitation to Blackwood Manor, the autumn of 1925, had draped London in a mantle of gold and russet, and the air carried that particular crispness that makes an Englishman feel simultaneously alive and faintly melancholy. In a quiet, impeccably ordered apartment on the third floor of Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat at his small breakfast table, legs crossed, patent leather shoes gleaming. A cup of tisane steaming gently beside him. The famous little Belgian detective, with the egg-shaped head and the magnificent moustaches that were the envy of half the dandies in Piccadilly, was engaged in the pleasant ritual of opening his morning post. Letters were arranged in two precise piles, the unimportant and the merely tedious. A third, much smaller pile, contained those rare missives that promised to exercise what Poirot modestly referred to as the little grey cells. It was into this third pile that he slipped a heavy cream envelope sealed with crimson wax. The crest impressed upon the wax was unfamiliar to him. An owl perched upon an open book, beneath it the motto Veritas vos liberabit. Yet the handwriting on the front possessed an urgency that even Poirot's disciplined eye could not ignore. He turned the envelope once, twice, as though weighing the soul of its sender. Then slit it neatly with the silver knife kept for that sole purpose. The paper within was thick, almost ostentatiously expensive, and the message had been penned in a strong, impatient hand. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, you will not remember me, for we have never met, but I have followed your exploits with the closest attention for many years. I find myself now in a position where only a mind of your singular clarity can save me, perhaps save many, from a catastrophe that is as much moral as it is criminal. I beg you, therefore, to grant me the favour of your company this coming Friday at Blackwood Manor in Surrey. A motor will meet the 3.17 from Waterloo. I enclose a railway voucher for yourself, and, should he care to accompany you, your friend Captain Hastings. I dare not commit more to paper. Suffice it to say that I have in my possession a substance which may alter the course of medical history, and that 3 lives, one of them, I fear, my own wife's, hang upon a decision I am incompetent to make alone. There are those who would kill to influence that decision. There are those who already have killed. Come, I implore you. The matter admits of no delay. Yours, in profoundest anxiety, Reginald Hawthorne, M.D. FRCP. Poirot laid the letter down, and for a long moment stared at nothing at all. A doctor's dilemma, he thought. And yet the phrase, "those who already have killed," pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the polite sentences. He reached for the bell and, when his valet George appeared with the silent efficiency of a well-trained shadow, requested that Captain Hastings be telephoned at his club and asked whether he would care for a few days in the country. Hastings, when he arrived 20 minutes later, still smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and the fog of St. James's, was delighted. "A house party, by Jove! Haven't had a proper one since before the war. And a medical mystery into the bargain. You'll sort it all out in a couple of hours, Poirot, and then we can shoot pheasants or whatever one does in Surrey." Poirot permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "My friend, you have the optimism of a bulldog, and the imagination of a turnip. We shall see." Friday found them installed in a first-class compartment, the train rattling southward through the leaf-strewn suburbs and into the gentle hills of Surrey. Hastings gazed out at the passing scenery with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man who believed that any change was bound to be an improvement, while Poirot sat very still, hands folded upon the head of his Malacca cane, turning over in his mind the curious phrases of Dr. Hawthorne's letter, a substance that could alter the course of medical history, 3 lives hanging in the balance, and the chilling suggestion that murder had already been done. At a small country station, a gleaming Daimler waited, driven by a taciturn chauffeur in bottle green livery. The drive to Blackwood Manor took them along narrow lanes overhung with beech and oak, the late afternoon sun striping the road with gold. At last, the car turned between tall gateposts of weathered stone and proceeded up a winding avenue that ended before a great Tudor house of dark red brick, its chimneys crowned with twisted spirals, its mullioned windows glowing amber against the dusk. Ivy clung to the walls like a living tapestry, and rooks wheeled and cawed about the roof. As the Daimler drew up at the entrance, the massive oak door opened, and a tall man strode out to meet them. Dr. Reginald Hawthorne was perhaps 55, with thick silver hair brushed back from a high forehead, and the sort of face that looks as though it has been carved by responsibility rather than time. His eyes were a startling blue, brilliant and troubled, and the hand he extended to Poirot trembled almost imperceptibly. "Monsieur Poirot, you cannot know what your presence means to me." His voice was deep, cultivated, but threaded with exhaustion. "And Captain Hastings, an honour, sir. Come inside, come inside. The fog is rising." They passed beneath a stone archway into a hall panelled in ancient oak, where a log fire blazed beneath a carved mantel, and the air was scented with applewood and beeswax. Suits of armour stood like silent sentinels, and a grandfather clock ticked with the solemn authority of centuries. Hawthorne led them not to the drawing-room, as Poirot had expected, but directly to a small library on the ground floor, closing the door firmly behind them. Only then did he allow his composure to slip. "Thank God you are here," he said, passing a hand across his brow. "I have not slept in 3 nights. I am surrounded by people I have known for years. My wife, my colleagues, my own flesh and blood, and I no longer know whom I dare trust." Poirot regarded him steadily. "Begin at the beginning, Docteur. Omit nothing. The little details, they are everything." Hawthorne took a deep breath. "6 months ago I returned from an expedition to the Upper Amazon. Among the tribes there, I discovered a plant, unknown to Western botany, whose sap, when refined, arrests the progress of a rare and invariably fatal blood disease we call hemlock fever. I brought back a small quantity of the root. From it, I have distilled enough serum for exactly 1 full course of treatment. 1 life can be saved. No more." He crossed to a wall safe, concealed behind a false panel of books, worked the combination, and drew out a small crystal vial filled with a liquid that shimmered faintly green in the firelight. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the only hope for 3 people. The first is Sir William Hargrove, the industrialist whose grants have funded my laboratory for a decade. Without his money, research into hemlock fever ceases entirely. The second is Dr. Margaret Leland, a brilliant young pathologist in Cambridge, 32 years old, already a Fellow of the Royal Society. If she dies, a generation of discovery dies with her. The third, his voice cracked, the third is my wife, Evelyn. She contracted the fever in Brazil while nursing me through a bout of malaria. The symptoms are only now appearing. Poirot's gaze never left the vial. And you cannot decide which life is worthiest? I am a doctor, Hawthorne said bitterly. I am sworn to preserve life, but I am also a man. How does one weigh a wife against the future of medicine itself? Hastings shifted uncomfortably. Dash it all, sir. Can't you synthesize more of the stuff? Hawthorne shook his head. The plant flowers only once every 7 years. The next harvest is 6.5 years away. And even then, the tribes guard it jealously. I barely escaped with my life the last time. A silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last Poirot spoke softly. And the murders you spoke of in your letter? Hawthorne's face drained of colour. 2 nights ago, someone attempted to steal the serum. My laboratory assistant, poor fellows, disturbed the intruder. He was struck down, skull fractured. He lingers still, unlikely to recover. And last night, he swallowed. Last night a maid found a dead rat on the doorstep of the east wing, its throat cut and a note pinned to its fur. Choose quickly, doctor, or others will choose for you. Poirot's eyes gleamed. You have the note? Hawthorne produced it from his pocket, a scrap of common writing paper, the words printed in crude capitals. Poirot examined it, sniffed it delicately, and slipped it into his pocketbook. Tell me now, he said, who else is in the house this weekend? Hawthorne counted on his fingers. My wife, Evelyn. My old colleague and rival, Victor Langford. He believes the serum should go to pure science, not sentiment. My nurse, Clara Beaumont, who has been with me since my student days. My brother-in-law, Colonel Bertram Forsyth, Evelyn's brother, who thinks the whole business is sentimental nonsense and that money should decide. And my nephew, Edmund Thorne, who hopes to inherit my practice one day. The servants, of course, but they have been with us forever. Poirot nodded slowly. 6 persons with access to the house, each with a possible interest in the outcome. And the serum is kept in the safe in my study, which is locked at all times. Only I know the combination. But I tell you, Poirot, I feel eyes upon me constantly. I am watched. I am judged. At that moment, the gong sounded for dinner. Hawthorne started like a nervous horse. Come, he said, attempting a smile. Let us meet the rest of the party. Perhaps with you here, the shadows will retreat a little. As they moved towards the door, Poirot laid a gentle hand upon the doctor's sleeve. One thing more, mon ami. This plant from the Amazon, it has a name. Hawthorne hesitated. The natives call it Yanamoro. In their tongue, it means the green that chooses. Poirot's moustache gave the faintest twitch. The green that chooses, he repeated softly. How very appropriate. And with that, the 3 men stepped out into the corridor, where the firelight danced upon ancient armor, and the great house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the choice that would unleash either salvation or murder. Little did any of them suspect that before the weekend was out, the choice would be taken from Dr. Hawthorne's hands in the most irreversible manner imaginable. Chapter 2. Shadows over the Symposium. Dinner on that first evening at Blackwood Manor was a masterpiece of civilized discomfort. The long mahogany table glittered with Georgian silver and candlelight. The crystal rang softly whenever a glass was lifted, and the conversation flowed with the brittle brightness of thin ice over deep water. Poirot, seated at Lady Evelyn's right, observed everything with the quiet intensity of a cat, watching a cage of particularly nervous birds. Lady Evelyn Hawthorne was still beautiful at 45. though beauty of a fragile hothouse kind. Pale gold hair swept into a low chignon, skin like porcelain, and eyes the colour of winter seas. She wore emeralds at her throat that exactly matched the tremor in her smile. Across from her sat Dr. Victor Langford, lean, dark, and saturnine, his surgeon's fingers drumming a silent tattoo on the damask cloth whenever the subject of the serum arose. Colonel Forsyth, red-faced and walrus-moustached, attacked his saddle of mutton as though it had personally insulted the regiment. Young Edmund Thorne, barely 23, kept his gaze fixed upon his plate except when it darted, quick as a lizard, toward the head of the table where his uncle presided. And at Dr. Hawthorne's left hand sat Miss Clara Beaumont, the nurse, neat in navy silk, her capable hands folded, her expression one of watchful devotion. The talk began innocently enough with the pheasant and the claret, but it was impossible to keep the serpent out of Eden for long. It was Langford who introduced it, leaning forward with the lazy grace of a fencing master delivering a thrust. "Reginald," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "have you reached a decision yet? The scientific world is waiting. Dr. Leland's paper on cellular mutation was brilliant. If she dies before completing the follow-up work, it will be a tragedy for humanity." Lady Evelyn's fork clattered against her plate. "And if my wife dies," Hawthorne said quietly, "it will be a tragedy for me." "Sentiment," Langford murmured, almost to himself, but loud enough, always sentiment. Colonel Forsyth gave a bark of laughter. "Damned right it's sentiment. Give the stuff to Hargrove, man. He's paid for it 100 times over. Money talks, always has." Edmund flushed crimson. "Uncle, you can't seriously consider selling a human life to the highest bidder." "Can't I?" the colonel retorted. "Seen enough men die for want of a shilling in my time. At least Hargrove's shilling is honest." Clara Beaumont spoke for the first time, her voice low but clear. "There is only one honest choice. The doctor must give the serum to the person he loves most. Everything else is sophistry." Lady Evelyn reached out and pressed the nurse's hand in gratitude, but Poirot noticed that Hawthorne's eyes did not meet his wife's. Instead, they rested upon the empty place that had been set, out of courtesy perhaps, for the absent Sir William Hargrove, who had telegraphed that afternoon that urgent business detained him in London. Coffee was served in the drawing-room, a magnificent apartment panelled in green silk and hung with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow every gesture. A gramophone played something soft and Viennese. The fire settled into ruby caves. It was then that Dr. Hawthorne rose, deathly pale. "Forgive me," he said, "but the events of the day have exhausted me. I must retire to my study and think. I have asked that no one disturb me until morning. Whatever decision I reach, I shall announce at breakfast." He bowed stiffly and left the room. They heard his footsteps recede along the corridor, heard the heavy door of the study close, heard the decisive click of the lock and the scrape of the key being withdrawn on the inside. Conversation resumed in a desultory fashion, but the heart had gone out of it. One by one the guests drifted away. Langford to the library, the colonel to the billiard-room, with Edmund trailing reluctantly behind, Lady Evelyn pleading a headache, Clara Beaumont to check on the injured laboratory assistant in the East Wing. By 11:30, the great house was silent, save for the wind prowling around the eaves and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Poirot and Hastings lingered in the hall. "A curious atmosphere, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot murmured. "It is like watching 6 people playing cards, when only one can win the pot." and all know that the stakes are life and death. Hastings yawned. "Think I'll turn in, old man. Coming? In a moment, mon ami. I wish first to assure myself that the doctor is comfortable." Together they walked softly along the west corridor until they reached the study door. Solid oak, iron-bound, with a single Yale lock and a heavy brass keyhole. From beneath the door, a thin blade of light showed that the lamp within still burned. Poirot bent and peered through the keyhole. He saw Dr. Hawthorne seated at his desk, head in hands, the green shimmer of the serum vial catching the lamplight like a malevolent star. After a moment, the doctor rose, crossed to the safe, opened it, and stood for a long time simply staring at the vial. Then, with a gesture of utter weariness, he closed the safe again, locked it, returned to his chair, and appeared to fall asleep where he sat. Satisfied, Poirot straightened. "All is as it should be, Hastings. Come." They retired. The house slept, or appeared to. It was shortly after 3 in the morning when the scream came, high, raw, unmistakably female. Lights blazed along the upper corridor. Clara Beaumont, hair loose about her shoulders, stood barefoot outside the study door, beating upon it with both fists. "Doctor! Dr. Hawthorne! Open the door! Please God! Open the door!" Poirot arrived first, Hastings panting behind him. The key was still in the lock on the inside. The door refused to yield. Through the keyhole, Poirot saw what Clara had already glimpsed. Dr. Reginald Hawthorne slumped forward across his desk, a hypodermic syringe protruding from the vein of his left forearm, the crystal vial lying shattered beside his outstretched hand. Its precious contents already absorbed into the leather-topped desk, or into the veins of the man who had created it. The impossible had happened. A man had been murdered, or had murdered himself, in a room locked from the inside with bars upon the windows and no trace of any other human soul. And the serum, the miraculous, terrible serum that had brought them all to Sturk. Blackwood Manor was gone. Chapter 3. The Locked Room Enigma. The house awoke to a morning of iron-grey skies and dripping yew trees, as though the very weather mourned Dr. Hawthorne's death. By the time Poirot descended the great staircase at 7:30, the hall already hummed with restrained panic. Maids whispering behind their hands, the butler polishing the same silver salver for the 3rd time, and the local constable, a gangling youth named Jakes, standing helplessly beside the study door, as if posted there to prevent the impossible crime from happening again. Poirot took one look at the young man and dismissed him with a gentle but implacable gesture. "You will oblige me, mon constable, by fetching Inspector Graves from Guildford. Tell him Hercule Poirot requests his presence and that the matter is of the most urgent. Afterwards, you will touch nothing. You will speak to no one. You will await instructions. Compris?" Constable Jakes touched his helmet and fled with obvious relief. Poirot turned the key, still in the lock on the inside, exactly as it had been found, and entered the study alone. The room smelled faintly of formaldehyde, coal smoke, and something sweeter, almost floral, that clung to the back of the throat. Heavy velvet curtains were still drawn. When Poirot pulled them back, pallid light revealed the tragedy in merciless detail. Dr. Reginald Hawthorne lay as death had surprised him. Torso across the desk, right cheek pressed to a half-written letter, left arm dangling, the hypodermic syringe still embedded just above the cuff of his white shirt. The crystal vial lay in fragments beneath his right hand, its precious green contents soaked into the Moroccan leather blotter in a dark, irregular stain. On the blotter, in Hawthorne's own handwriting, were the words, "I choose none. The responsibility is too great. Forgive me, Evelyn." At first glance, it was the perfect tableau of suicide. Despairing doctor, fatal overdose of his own miraculous serum, door locked from within, key on the inside, windows barred and undisturbed, chimney far too narrow for anything larger than a starling. Yet Poirot's gaze, sharp as a watchmaker's glass, moved over every surface with growing dissatisfaction. He knelt beside the body. The syringe had been plunged deep, professionally deep, yet the angle was awkward for a left-handed man, and Hawthorne had been famously left-handed. Poirot had watched him sign the dinner menu with his left hand only the previous evening. Moreover, the rubber bulb of the syringe still held a trace of the green serum. The plunger had been depressed fully, but the needle was inserted into the cephalic vein of the left forearm. Again, the wrong arm for a left-handed man attempting self-destruction. "Non, non, et encore non," Poirot murmured. "This is murder, murder most cunningly contrived." He rose and began a systematic exploration. The room was 20 feet square, panelled in dark oak, with one door, the one now behind him. 2 windows, barred with ornamental iron that showed no sign of tampering, and a marble fireplace large enough for a man to stand in, but blocked by a heavy iron fireback. A Persian rug covered most of the floor. Poirot rolled it back and tapped the floorboards, solid, no hollow sound. He examined the ceiling, plaster recently decorated, no trapdoor. He even climbed onto the desk to peer up the chimney, emerging with soot on his immaculate spats and a look of profound irritation. At that moment, Hastings burst in, hair on end, dressing gown flapping. "Great Scott, Poirot! They're saying the doctor's killed himself. Is it true?" "It is not true," Poirot replied crisply. "It is murder, and murder of the most interesting. Observe, my friend, the syringe is in the left arm, yet your doctor was left-handed. Observe also the position of the fragments of the vial. They lie beneath the right hand, which would have had to sweep across the body after injection, an impossible movement for a man already succumbing to a massive overdose. And observe this." He pointed to a tiny pinprick of green on the otherwise spotless white cuff of Hawthorne's shirt, 3 inches above the injection site. "The serum, it has travelled upward against gravity. Someone held the arm and forced the plunger after death had already begun to stiffen the limbs. Rigour is commencing even now." Hastings paled. "But the door was locked from the inside, the key on the inside." "Precisely," said Poirot with grim satisfaction. "That is what makes our murderer so very clever and so very vulnerable." The guests were assembled in the drawing-room under the nervous eye of the butler, when Poirot rejoined them 20 minutes later. Lady Evelyn sat white and still upon a sofa, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Victor Langford stood at the window staring out at the rain, hands clasped behind his back. Colonel Forsyth paced like a caged bear. Clara Beaumont's eyes were red but dry. She sat very straight, hands folded in her lap as though at church. Young Edmund Thorne looked as though he had not slept at all. His pupils were wide and dark. Poirot surveyed them calmly. "Mesdames et messieurs, I regret to inform you that Dr. Hawthorne did not take his own life. He was murdered. The local police are on their way, but until they arrive, no one will leave this house. I, Hercule Poirot, will discover the truth." A ripple of shock passed through the room, yet Poirot noticed, with the part of his mind that noticed everything, that not one of them looked wholly surprised. Lady Evelyn was the first to speak, her voice a thread. "But the door, the locked door—" "Will be explained," Poirot said gently, in the fullness of time. For now, I require from each of you a precise account of your movements between midnight and 3 o'clock this morning. Captain Hastings will take notes." He began with Lady Evelyn, then Langford, the Colonel, Clara, Edmund, each claiming to have been asleep, each supported by thin alibis that crumbled under the mildest probing. While Hastings wrote laboriously, Poirot's gaze drifted to the fireplace in the drawing-room, to the ornate brass fender, to the faint trace of green on the hearthrug that no one else had yet noticed. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the leaded windows like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 9, and Poirot felt the familiar thrill that came when order began to emerge from chaos. The locked room had yielded its first secret. Murder had entered after the door was locked, and murder had left again, taking the key with it for a moment, only to return it from the inside. Somewhere there was a duplicate key, or a trick with string or ice, or a clever accomplice. And somewhere among these 6 pale faces sat the person who had turned a doctor's dilemma into a doctor's death. Chapter 4. Whispers of Deception. Rain lashed the windows of Blackwood Manor all that afternoon, turning the world beyond the panes into a grey, streaming blur. Inside, the house felt smaller, the corridors narrower, every footstep echoing like an accusation. Inspector Graves had arrived from Guildford just after 11. A solid, red-faced man with the slow, deliberate manner of one who prefers sheep-stealing to locked-room murders. He listened to Poirot's preliminary findings, tugged at his moustache, and announced that the inquest would be held on Monday. Until then, the study was sealed, the body removed to the ice-house, and the 6 principal guests were requested, very politely, to remain on the premises. Poirot wasted no time. While Graves and his sergeant poked about the study with elephantine caution, the little Belgian conducted his own, infinitely more delicate exploration. He began with the servants' hall, where the butler, the housekeeper, and the maids were only too eager to talk. From them he learned that Dr. Hawthorne had been receiving anonymous letters for a fortnight. Always the same crude printing, always the same threat. Give the serum to the one who deserves it, or pay the price. The letters had been burned, but the fear had not. Next he examined the doctor's bedroom, the laboratory in the east wing, the conservatory filled with exotic plants that still carried the humid breath of the Amazon. In the laboratory he discovered that the safe, identical to the one in the study, had been opened the previous week, and a small quantity of refined serum removed. The theft had been disguised by topping up the vial with distilled water. Someone in the house had been planning for weeks. By 4 o'clock, Poirot had gathered the suspects once more in the drawing-room, and, with the fire hissing and spitting behind the guard, began a gentle but relentless cross-examination. "Lady Evelyn," he began, voice soft as silk, "you told me this morning that you retired at 11 and slept until Miss Beaumont's scream awoke you. Yet the maid swears she brought you a hot water bottle at 1:30 because you rang and complained of the cold. Why did you not mention this earlier?" Lady Evelyn's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. I was confused. The shock—" "Perfectly," Poirot said, bowing. "And you, Dr. Langford, you spent the evening in the library. Yet the library fire was dead when the constable examined it, and there was no book disturbed upon the table. Where precisely were you between midnight and 3? Langford's dark eyes glittered. "Walking, thinking. A man does not sleep easily when the future of medicine is being decided by emotion rather than reason." Colonel Forsyth gave a disgusted snort. "Walking be damned! Saw you myself, skulking about the west corridor at 1 o'clock. Thought you were after the brandy." Langford smiled thinly. "I might have been." Clara Beaumont sat very still, but her knuckles were white. Poirot turned to her. "Mademoiselle, you discovered the body. You beat upon the door. Yet when I arrived, your feet were bare and the soles perfectly clean, although the corridor runner is old and sheds fluff. You had not then come far. Your room is at the far end of the east wing." "How is this?" Clara flushed. I heard a sound, a thud. I ran. In bare feet? In February? Most devoted." Young Edmund Thorne had begun to tremble again. Poirot fixed him with a kindly but implacable eye. "Monsieur Edmund, you play billiards with your uncle the Colonel until midnight. Then you say you went to bed. Yet your shoes, which I have just examined, have fresh mud upon the soles, mud from the rose garden path, which is soaked through. Why did you go outside at dead of night?" Edmund opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I needed air." The room crackled with suspicion. Accusations flew like sparks. Langford accused the Colonel of wanting the formula sold to the highest bidder. The Colonel accused Langford of professional jealousy. Lady Evelyn accused Clara of an unhealthy attachment to her husband. Clara accused no one, but her silence was louder than words. Poirot let them argue until voices grew hoarse, then raised one small hand. Instantly, the room fell still. "Enough," he said quietly. "You exhaust yourselves with suspicion while the murderer smiles. Observe instead the facts." He produced a folded sheet of paper and held it up. "This was found inside the lining of Dr. Hawthorne's dressing-gown pocket when the body was undressed. It is a prescription, written in Dr. Langford's handwriting, for a massive dose of the serum. Enough to kill, not to cure." Langford leapt to his feet. "Forgeries! Anyone could have—" "Possibly," Poirot conceded. "Yet the ink is fresh. The paper torn from your own prescription pad in the laboratory. Curious, n'est-ce pas?" Before Langford could reply, the butler entered, bearing a small silver salver, upon which lay a single white feather and a playing card, the ace of spades. A folded note accompanied them. The note read, in the same crude printing as the earlier threats, "One down. Choose quickly, or the next will be the woman you love." Lady Evelyn gave a choking cry and fainted clean away. Clara rushed to her side. Colonel Forsyth swore a soldier's oath that turned the air blue. Langford stared at the feather as though it might bite him. Poirot alone remained calm. He turned the ace of spades over. On the back, someone had scrawled in green ink, the exact shade of the missing serum, "Tick-tock, doctor." But the doctor was dead, and the clock continued to tick for the living. Outside, the rain redoubled, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Inside, the net of deception tightened, and Poirot felt the first faint thrill of the pattern beginning to emerge. Someone in that room had entered a locked study, administered a fatal overdose, and left again without disturbing bolt or bar. Someone had planned this murder with cold and exquisite care. Chapter 5. Alliance's fractured night fell upon Blackwood Manor like a velvet curtain soaked in water. The rain had ceased, but the wind prowled the chimneys and rattled every casement as though testing for weakness. Inside, the great house seemed to have shrunk to a single heartbeat of lamplight and suspicion. Dinner was a travesty. Food pushed around plates, wine untouched, conversation limited to brittle murmurs. Even Colonel Forsyth's customary bluster had collapsed into sullen silence. Poirot, sensing that the murderer thrived on this atmosphere of dread, resolved to break it. At 10 o'clock, he summoned everyone to the long gallery, where portraits of long-dead Hawthorns glowered down upon their descendants, and announced that he would perform a reconstruction of the previous night's events. "We shall proceed exactly as before," he declared, clapping his small hands with decisive energy. "Dr. Langford, you will retire to the library. Colonel, you and Monsieur Edmund will repair to the billiard room. Lady Evelyn, you will take to your bedroom. Mademoiselle Clara, you will walk the east wing as though checking upon the injured assistant. I myself, with Captain Hastings, will wait at the hall. At precisely midnight, we shall all move exactly as we did last night. Only this time, mes amis, the murderer will betray himself by the very perfection of his repetition." They obeyed, though reluctantly. The house settled into uneasy quiet. Hastings, stationed beside Poirot at the foot of the staircase, whispered, "Do you really expect the blighter to try again?" "Non, mon ami," Poirot replied softly. "I expect him to be unable to resist the temptation to prove he can do it twice." The grandfather clock struck 12 slow notes. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Footsteps sounded faintly overhead. Then, at 12:23, the exact minute Clara Beaumont had screamed the night before. A single shot cracked through the house like a whip. Pandemonium. Lights blazed along corridors. Hastings and Poirot raced toward the sound, and found Victor Langford staggering from the library, blood streaming from a graze along his left temple. "Someone fired at me through the window," he gasped. "I saw the flash, nothing more." The library window stood open to the night. Rain had begun again and was already soaking the carpet. On the floor lay a Webley service revolver, Colonel Forsyth's taken from the gun-room. One round discharged, the smell of cordite sharp in the air. Forsyth himself arrived at a lumbering run, face purple. "That's my revolver! Who the devil—" His words died as he saw the look on Poirot's face. The little detective knelt, examined the weapon, and held up a single strand of dark hair, caught in the trigger guard, hair that exactly matched Langford's own. Langford laughed, a brittle sound. "Very clever. Someone wishes to implicate me further." Poirot said nothing, but his eyes were bright and dangerous. The attempted shooting shattered what remained of civility. Accusations ricocheted like bullets. Lady Evelyn declared she would leave at dawn whatever the police said. Clara Beaumont wept silently in a corner. Edmund Thorne shook as though with fever. Only Langford retained a sardonic calm, dabbing at his wound with a handkerchief that came away crimson. At 2 a.m, Poirot found Hastings in the smoking room, nursing a whiskey he did not want. "This is getting out of hand, Poirot. Someone's playing cat and mouse with us." "Exactly so," Poirot replied, "and the mouse believes himself the cat. But observe, Hastings, tonight the would-be murderer made 2 mistakes. First, he fired from outside, yet the revolver was inside. Second, he left the window unlatched, something our killer was far too careful to do when the stakes were real. This was not murder, it was theatre. Then why risk it? Because fear is a weapon, and our murderer wields it like a stiletto." Dawn brought a new and more intimate horror. The housemaid, entering Lady Evelyn's room with morning tea, found her mistress apparently asleep, only apparently. A glass on the bedside table held the dregs of barley water, laced with a massive dose of chloral hydrate. Lady Evelyn was unconscious, pulse thready, skin cold as marble. Clara Beaumont, summoned in frantic haste, worked over her with hot water bottles and strong coffee until, by some miracle, the danger passed. Poirot stood at the foot of the bed, watching Clara's skilled hands, watching also the expressions that flitted across the faces gathered in the doorway. When Lady Evelyn at last opened her eyes, Her first whispered words were, "Reginald, forgive me, I never meant—" She relapsed into exhausted sleep before she could finish. Clara drew the curtains and turned to Poirot with eyes that blazed. Someone tried to kill her because they believe she knows too much, or because they wish to silence the only person the doctor truly loved. Or, Poirot said quietly, because they wish us to believe exactly that. He led Clara from the room, and in the corridor asked a single question. "Tell me, mademoiselle, when you brought Lady Evelyn her nightly barley water, did you taste it first, as nurses sometimes do?" Clara hesitated the merest fraction. "No," she said at last. "Her ladyship has always prepared it herself. She has difficulty sleeping since Brazil." Poirot nodded, but his gaze was thoughtful. Later, alone in the conservatory, amid the heavy scent of night-blooming orchids, he fitted together the new pieces. The attempted shooting, staged, the near-fatal overdose, genuine enough to terrify. And something else. In Lady Evelyn's jewel case, he had found a tiny empty phial, bearing the faintest trace of green residue. Someone had removed a sample of the serum long ago, perhaps weeks ago. The alliances in the house were fracturing like ice on a pond. Langford no longer spoke to the Colonel. Clara avoided Edmund's pleading eyes. Lady Evelyn, when she woke fully, refused to see anyone but Poirot. And in the silence between heartbeats, the little Belgian began to perceive the shape of something monstrous. A crime that had begun long before Dr. Hawthorne locked his study door. A crime rooted not in sudden passion, but in patient, spider-like calculation. Outside, the wind dropped. A weak sun struggled through the clouds, gilding the wet lawns. Inside Blackwood Manor, the murderer prepared the final act, confident that chaos now masked every footstep. Poirot smoothed his moustaches, allowed himself the very smallest of smiles, and went in search of a length of copper wire, a child's magnet, and the truth. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The drawing-room at Blackwood Manor had never felt so small. Though the fire roared and the chandeliers blazed, the 6 survivors seemed pressed together by the weight of what they now knew. 2 attempts at murder since dawn, 1 man already dead, and the police still hours away on flooded roads. Outside, a pale February sun hung low, turning the wet park to a sheet of hammered silver. Poirot stood before the marble fireplace, small and immaculate, hands clasped behind his back. Every eye followed him, some with hope, some with dread, one pair with the cold brightness of a man who believes the game already won. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice soft yet carrying to the furthest corner. "The time for shadows is ended. We have played the murderer's game long enough. Now we play mine." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost painful. "You will recall that Dr. Hawthorne was found in a room locked from within, key on the inside, windows barred, chimney impassable. A classic problème du locked room. Yet locked rooms, like all illusions, depend upon what the eye expects to see. Remove expectation, and the impossible becomes merely ingenious." He turned to Inspector Graves, who had finally arrived, soaked and sullen. "Inspector, you have examined the study door. Tell us again about the lock." Graves cleared his throat. "Yale patent, single-cylinder, spring bolt. Key was on the inside, turned full. No sign of tampering." "Precisely," Poirot said. "And yet the murderer entered after the door was locked, administered the fatal injection, shattered the vial, wrote the suicide note, and left, locking the door behind him and returning the key to the inside. How?" He let the question hang, then produced from his pocket a length of fine copper wire, bent into a hook and a small horseshoe magnet. Observe. He crossed to the drawing-room door, closed it, turned the key from the outside and withdrew it. Then, kneeling, he slipped the wire through the gap beneath the door, fished with delicate precision until the hook caught the key's bow, and gently drew the key outward until it projected beneath the door. A flick of the magnet attached itself to the iron key, another gentle pull, and the key slid free into his hand. A collective intake of breath. Child's play, Poirot continued, for anyone who has practiced. The key is then used to unlock the door from the outside, the crime committed, the door relocked, and the key pushed back beneath, far enough to be reached again by the wire, drawn inside, and reinserted into the lock from within. The gap beneath these old doors is generous. A thin oriental rug hides everything. Voila! The locked room vanishes. Colonel Forsyth found his voice first. Then anyone could have done it. No, Poirot corrected gently. Only someone who knew the doctor's habits intimately. Someone who knew he would sit at his desk long into the night. Someone who knew he kept a spare syringe in the left-hand drawer. Someone who had watched him inject himself with harmless vitamins 100 times and could imitate the motion perfectly. Someone, in short, who had access to the laboratory and to the house keys long before this weekend. His gaze moved to Clara Beaumont. The nurse had gone very white. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said almost kindly, "you have been devoted to Dr. Hawthorne for 15 years. You told us you loved him like a father. Yet love can curdle into something darker when it is not returned. You believed that if Lady Evelyn were gone, the doctor would turn at last to you. You stole small quantities of the serum weeks ago, experimenting until you discovered that a massive dose was lethal. You forged the anonymous notes to increase his terror. You staged the attack on the laboratory assistant to make the threat seem external. And last night, you waited until the house was quiet, used the trick of the key, entered the study, and injected the overdose while the doctor dozed, exhausted by doubt." Clara stared at him, dry-eyed. "You have no proof." "But I have," Poirot replied. He produced a tiny glass phial from his waistcoat. This was found in the conservatory drain, washed but not clean. It contains traces of the serum, and your fingerprints, mademoiselle, because you alone handled the doctor's vials without gloves. The laboratory assistant, though still weak, has regained consciousness long enough to describe his attacker. A woman in a nurse's cape. And finally, he turned to Lady Evelyn, who sat wrapped in blankets, pale but composed. "Madame, you woke this morning believing you had taken poison. In fact, you took only chloral, enough to sleep deeply. The barley water was prepared by Miss Beaumont, who wished you to appear the next victim, thereby deflecting suspicion from herself. But you, madame, had already emptied half the glass into the flower vase when you thought no one watched. You have never trusted sleeping draughts since Brazil. The level was too low to kill." Clara Beaumont rose slowly. For a moment it seemed she might bolt, but Inspector Graves blocked the door. Instead she laughed. A small, broken sound. "He was going to give the serum to that Cambridge woman," she said, voice flat. "After all I had done for him, 15 years, I was nothing to him, nothing." Lady Evelyn made a choked sound. Clara turned on her with sudden venom. "You had everything, beauty, position, his name, and still you complained. I would have died for him gladly." Poirot's voice cut through like a scalpel. "Instead you killed for him. There is a difference, mademoiselle." Clara's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of her as suddenly as it had come. Graves stepped forward with handcuffs. She offered her wrists without resistance. As she was led away, Poirot addressed the stunned room. The irony, mes amis, is that Dr. Hawthorne had already made his choice. In the half-written letter beneath his cheek, he named the recipient not Sir William, not Dr. Leland, not even his wife, but the Hospital for Incurables in Whitechapel, that they might study the serum and synthesize it for thousands. He chose humanity over the individual. Miss Beaumont killed him for a love that never existed, and in doing so destroyed the very miracle she wished to possess. Silence fell, heavy as velvet. Outside, the sun slipped behind a cloud, and the Silver Park turned suddenly cold. Hastings found his voice at last. "Poirot, how long have you known?" The little Belgian sighed. "From the moment I saw the pinprick of green on the cuff, mon ami. Only a nurse would think to hold the arm steady after death to prevent bruising. Only a nurse would know exactly where to insert the needle for instant effect. The rest was confirmation." He turned toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. The plant Yanamoro, the green that chooses, did indeed choose. It chose life over death, science over selfishness, even when the hand that held it was stained with murder." And with that, Hercule Poirot walked out into the fading light, leaving behind a house forever changed by the revelation that the most dangerous poison is not in any vial, but in the human heart. Chapter 7. Justice Served. The inquest was held 3 days later in the panelled library of Blackwood Manor, transformed for the occasion into a courtroom. Rain still tapped at the tall windows, but the storm had passed, leaving the Surrey hills washed clean and the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Reporters crowded the drive, held back by 2 bored constables. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, almost ceremonial, as though the house itself understood that the drama was ending. Clara Beaumont sat between 2 wardresses from Guildford Jail, dressed in the same neat navy coat and skirt she had worn at dinner that first evening. Only the absence of her starched cap and the faint bruising around her wrists from the handcuffs marked the change in her station. She was pale, but composed. Her eyes, dry since the moment of confession, now rested on nothing and no one. Coroner Hargreaves, a thin, precise man with pince-nez and a voice like parchment, opened proceedings with the brisk efficiency of one who had seen too many violent deaths. The medical evidence was brief and damning. Dr. Hawthorne had died of acute serum toxicity, enough of the concentrated Yanamoro extract to stop the heart within 90 seconds. The syringe bore only the doctor's fingerprints on the barrel and Clara Beaumont's on the plunger. The vial recovered from the conservatory drain carried the same combination. The laboratory assistant, now conscious, identified her voice and the rustle of a nurse's cape. Poirot gave evidence with his customary clarity. He demonstrated the copper wire and magnet trick again upon the library door, to a ripple of murmurs from the jury. He laid out the forged threatening notes, the staged attack on the assistant, the chloral in Lady Evelyn's barley water, all designed to create the illusion of an external menace, while Clara herself moved freely as the devoted nurse no one suspected. He spoke without drama, almost gently, yet every word fell like a stone into still water. When he had finished, the coroner asked Clara if she wished to speak. She rose slowly, hands clasped before her as though still holding a bedpan or a thermometer. "I have nothing to add," she said, a voice steady. "Monsieur Poirot has told the truth. I killed the man I loved because he was going to give away the only thing that might have bound him to me. I am not mad. I am not even sorry, except that I failed to make him see me before he died." She sat down. A single tear, the first anyone had seen, slid down her cheek and fell onto the navy skirt, darkening the wool. The jury returned its verdict in 7 minutes: willful murder against Clara Beaumont. Inspector Graves took her arm as the room emptied. At the door she paused, looked back once toward Lady Evelyn, who sat white-faced beside the empty fireplace, and spoke so softly that only Graves and Poirot heard. "Tell her the serum is safe." "I never touched the true vial in the safe. It was only the sample I stole weeks ago that I used. Tell her to give it to the Whitechapel Hospital, as he wanted. That, at least, I can still give him." Then she was gone, footsteps echoing away down the corridor that had once known the brisk, comforting rhythm of her starched apron. Lady Evelyn remained seated long after the room was empty. When Poirot approached, she looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in a week. "He chose the poor," she whispered. "All along, he chose the poor. And I thought he might choose me." Poirot bowed. "Madame, your husband chose the highest good he knew. That is a rare form of love, even if it is not the one we most desire." She nodded once and pressed a small key into his hand, the key to the study safe. "Will you come with me? I cannot bear to open it alone." Together they walked the silent west corridor. The study had been tidied, the desk blotter replaced, the broken glass swept away, but the air still carried the faint, sweet ghost of the Amazonian plant. Lady Evelyn opened the safe with trembling fingers. Inside lay the true vial, untouched, its wax seal intact, the liquid within glowing like captured moonlight. She lifted it out, as though it were alive. "He kept his promise," she said, "even in death." That afternoon a telegram was dispatched to the hospital in Whitechapel. 2 days later, Dr. Margaret Leland received an anonymous parcel containing detailed notes and enough refined serum to save her life and begin the long work of synthesis. Sir William Hargrove, informed that the miracle had been gifted to charity, surprised everyone by establishing a research foundation in Reginald Hawthorne's name. Within 5 years, hemlock fever was all but eradicated in Britain. Clara Beaumont stood trial at the spring assizes. She pleaded guilty, refused to mitigate, and was sentenced to death. On the morning fixed for execution, however, a petition signed by Lady Evelyn Hawthorne, Dr. Margaret Leland, and 200 grateful patients reached the Home Secretary. The sentence was commuted to life. Clara spent the remaining 38 years of her life nursing prisoners in Holloway, never speaking of Blackwood Manor again. On their last evening at the manor, Poirot and Hastings stood on the terrace watching the sun sink behind the yew trees. The house looked almost peaceful now, its windows catching the last light like drops of amber. "A sad business, Poirot," Hastings said. "All that brilliance, all that devotion, twisted into murder." Poirot lit a tiny cigarette and exhaled thoughtfully. "Love, mon ami, is the most dangerous serum of all. One drop can heal. Too much, and the heart stops forever." He flicked the cigarette into the darkness, turned up the collar of his overcoat, and together they walked down the gravel drive to the waiting car. Behind them, Blackwood Manor settled into silence, its shadows finally at rest, the green that chooses safely on its way to those who most needed choosing. Chapter 8. The Second Confession. 3 weeks after Clara Beaumont was taken away in handcuffs, Poirot received a telegram that brought him back to Blackwood Manor one final time. It was brief, written in Lady Evelyn's shaking hand. "Something is wrong. The true vial is missing. Please come at once." E.H. The house felt different in early March. Windows thrown open to the mild air, daffodils pushing through the soaked flower beds, the smell of death replaced by beeswax and lilac. Yet the moment Poirot stepped into the hall, he sensed the same oppression that had clung to the rafters before. Lady Evelyn waited for him alone, thinner, eyes ringed with violet shadows. "It was not Clara," she said without greeting. "The real vial, the one sealed with red wax, has vanished from the safe. I checked yesterday. Only Reginald and I knew the combination, and Reginald is dead." Poirot's moustache gave a single ominous twitch. "Show me." The study had been left untouched since the inquest. Dust filmed the desk. The leather blotter still bore the faint green stain. Lady Evelyn opened the safe, empty. Only a square of darker paint showed where the vial had rested for months. Poirot examined the safe with microscopic care. No scratches on the lock, no signs of force. Yet when he swung the door fully open, he noticed something new. A hairline crack in the plaster behind the safe, running upward like a lightning bolt. He pressed it. A narrow panel, no wider than a book, slid aside to reveal a shallow cavity. Inside lay the missing vial, seal intact, and a folded sheet of paper in Dr. Hawthorne's handwriting. Poirot read it aloud. "If you are reading this, I am almost certainly dead. The serum you seek is safe, but not for the reasons you believe. Clara is innocent of my murder. She stole a sample, yes, and perhaps she would have killed me one day, but not that night. Someone else entered the study after me. Someone who knew the hidden panel behind the safe, who knew the combination, who knew everything. I recognized the scent of her perfume as the needle went in. Forgive her if you can. She believed she was saving me from a greater sin. R.H." Lady Evelyn's knees buckled. Poirot guided her to a chair. "Her," he repeated softly. She covered her face. "It was me," she whispered. "I killed him." The confession came in a rush, as though a dam had finally burst. She had never had hemlock fever. The symptoms were skillfully faked. Tremors induced by small doses of belladonna, pallor from rice powder, and exhaustion. For months she had lived in terror that Reginald would give the serum to charity or to science, leaving her nothing but the empty title of a widow. She had watched Clara's growing obsession and deliberately fed it, leaving anonymous notes where the nurse would find them, planting the forged prescription in Langford's pocket, even encouraging Clara to steal a sample so that suspicion would fall on her when the time came. On the night of the murder, she had waited until the house slept, used the hidden panel, a secret known only to husband and wife, to enter the study after Reginald locked the door, injected the overdose while he dozed, shattered the decoy vial Clara had prepared, written the suicide note in a perfect imitation of his hand, then returned to her room through the panel and the disused servant's stair. The wire and magnet trick had never been needed. She had simply never left the room in the eyes of the house. "Why confess now?" Poirot asked quietly. "Because I thought I had won," Lady Evelyn said, voice breaking. "The vial was safe," Clara condemned. "The world would believe Reginald took his own life in despair. But when I moved the vial to the hiding place yesterday, I found his letter. He knew, all along he knew it was me, and he protected me even in death. I cannot bear it." She reached into her cardigan pocket and drew out a small pearl-handled revolver, Colonel Forsyth's spare, kept in her bedside drawer since the night of the staged shooting. "I intended to finish what the chloral began," she said, "but I find I lack the courage. Will you call Inspector Graves, Monsieur Poirot? I would rather hang than live with what I have become." Poirot took the revolver from her unresisting fingers. "No, madame. There is another way." He summoned the household, what remained of it. Colonel Forsyth, Langford, Edmund, even Clara Beaumont, brought from Holloway under guard for the day. In the drawing-room, He laid out the truth with merciless precision. Lady Evelyn's fake illness, her manipulation of Clara's devotion, the hidden panel, the final betrayal. Clara listened without expression. When Poirot finished, she spoke for the first time in weeks. "I hated you," she said to Lady Evelyn. "Now I only pity you. He forgave you. I never would have forgiven me." Lady Evelyn was arrested that afternoon. The charge was murder. The evidence, the letter, the panel, the revolver, her own confession, irrefutable. Yet when the trial came, the jury, moved by the tragedy of a brilliant man destroyed by the two women who loved him most, recommended mercy. The death sentence was commuted. Lady Evelyn Hawthorne spent the rest of her life in quiet atonement, endowing the Hawthorne Foundation that finally synthesized the serum and saved thousands. Clara Beaumont was pardoned and released within the year. She returned to nursing, this time among the poorest, and never spoke Reginald Hawthorne's name again. On the train back to London, Hastings, still shaken, asked the question that had haunted them both. "Poirot, how long had you suspected her?" The little Belgian gazed out at the passing fields, bright with spring. "From the moment I saw the chloral glass was only half full, mon ami. A genuine suicide attempt uses the entire dose. A staged one leaves room for rescue. After that, everything else, the faked illness, the perfect forgery of the note, the convenient hidden panel, fell into place. But I needed her conscience to finish the work my little grey cells began." He sighed, a rare sound of genuine sadness. "Love again, Hastings. Always love, the serpent in every paradise." At Waterloo, the sun was setting, turning the Thames to molten copper. Poirot adjusted his Homburg, smoothed his moustaches, and stepped down onto the platform with his usual jaunty precision. "Come, mon ami," he said. "There is a new tisane I wish to try, and life, she continues." Behind them, the case of the doctor's dilemma was closed forever. 2 women punished, 1 serum saved, and 1 brilliant man remembered not for how he died, but for the choice he made, even as the needle found his vein. Chapter 9. The third truth, the final revelation, did not come in the drawing room, nor in the study, nor even at Blackwood Manor itself. It came on a quiet April afternoon in Poirot's spotless flat at Whitehaven Mansions, when a registered packet arrived from a firm of solicitors in Guildford. Inside was a thick envelope addressed in Dr. Reginald Hawthorne's unmistakable hand, and sealed with the same crimson wax that had first drawn Poirot to Surrey. A single line on the outside read, "To be opened by Hercule Poirot only in the event that both Clara Beaumont and Lady Evelyn Hawthorne are convicted of my murder." Poirot slit the envelope with the silver knife he kept for such purposes. Inside lay a letter, and a smaller sealed note marked "Read Second." He began with the letter. "My dear Poirot, if you are reading this, then the elaborate charade I staged with Evelyn's help has succeeded beyond my hopes, or failed catastrophically. In either case, the truth can now be told. I am not dead. Or rather, I was never murdered. What died in that study was a carefully prepared simulacrum, a wax head modelled from life by a theatrical sculptor in Soho, clothed in my own suit, injected with enough of the serum to register as fatal when tested. The body you examined was removed by my faithful laboratory assistant Fellows, the same man who was supposedly attacked, through the hidden panel and the old icehouse tunnel before dawn. Fellows is now in Brazil with the true vial and the living plants necessary to propagate Yanomoro for the world. I staged my own death for 3 reasons. First, to escape the intolerable choice that was tearing my soul in half. The serum was never meant for one life. It was meant for all. but I could not bring myself to defy Evelyn's terror of dying, nor Clara's devotion, nor Langford's ambition, nor the pressure of wealth and politics. Suicide would have been cowardice. Murder, my own staged murder, was the only way to free the serum from human greed. Second, to punish those who had begun to circle me like wolves. Evelyn's feigned illness had become a prison. Clara's love had turned to obsession. Langford's jealousy threatened violence. By letting each believe they had caused my death, I gave them the mirror they needed. Clara confessed to a crime she believed she committed. Evelyn confessed to one she believed she had committed. Both will now live with the weight of a conscience I could no longer carry for them. Third, and most important, to protect the secret of synthesis. The formula is not in any safe. It is tattooed in microscopic script upon the inside of Fellows's forearm, a living document no thief can steal. By the time this letter reaches you, the plants will be growing in a remote mission garden, the serum already in production for the poorest clinics first. Forgive the deception, my friend. You, of all men, will understand that sometimes a lie in the service of life is the highest truth. Burn this after reading. Tell no one, not even Hastings. Let the world believe Hercule Poirot solved an impossible crime. Your reputation will only grow. With admiration and gratitude, Reginald Hawthorne. Somewhere south of the equator, Poirot sat motionless for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his manicured hand. Then he turned to the smaller sealed note. This one was addressed simply, to the one who truly deserved the serum. Inside was a single sheet. Give this to Dr. Margaret Leland. Tell her the plants flourish. Tell her the first 1,000 doses bear her name. She will understand. There was no signature, only a tiny pressed flower, green petals veined with gold, the Yanamoro blossom itself. Poirot did exactly as he was asked. He burned the letter in his tidy little grate, watching the flames curl the crimson wax into nothing. He delivered the flower and the message to astonished Dr. Leland at Cambridge, refusing to answer any questions beyond a patient recovered unexpectedly. He never told Hastings. He never told anyone. Years later, when hemlock fever became a footnote in medical textbooks, and the Hawthorne Foundation distributed the serum free to every corner of the empire, old colleagues would ask Poirot about the famous Blackwood case. He would only smile, tap the side of his nose, and say, "Ah, that one." A most satisfying illusion. The impossible, you see, is sometimes only what we are meant to believe. And in a hidden valley in Brazil, an elderly Englishman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes would tend rows of delicate green plants beneath a missionary cross, whispering to them in the native tongue he had never forgotten. Yanamoro, the green that chooses, chose after all. No one ever connected the celebrated Dr. Reginald Hawthorne, presumed murdered in 1925, with the quiet brother Reginald, who died peacefully in 1959, surrounded by children he had saved. And Hercule Poirot, alone in his London flat, kept the secret to his own grave, content that the greatest trick of his career was the one no one, not even the murderer, ever knew had been played. For in the end, the doctor's dilemma had only one solution: to remove the doctor from the equation entirely and let the serum choose humanity instead of the other way around. That, Poirot reflected as he poured his evening tisane, was perhaps the most perfect crime of all. Chapter 10. The Green That Chooses. Years passed, quiet, orderly years in which the name Blackwood Manor faded from the newspapers and settled into legend. The house itself was sold to a brewery magnate who turned it into a country hotel. Guests still asked to see the locked study. and the management obliged with a discreet brass plaque and a fabricated tale of murder solved by a famous Belgian detective. Only the oldest staff remembered that the plaque was on the wrong door. Hercule Poirot grew older with impeccable grace. The moustache remained magnificent, the waistcoats exquisite, the little grey cells as sharp as ever. Yet there were evenings when the London fog pressed against his windows and the fire burned low, that he would take from a locked drawer a small tin box containing one pressed green flower with golden veins. He never spoke of it, not even to Hastings, who had long since retired to the Argentine with a wife, a ranch, and an unshakable belief that the Blackwood case had ended with Lady Evelyn's confession. In the spring of 1938, a letter reached Whitehaven Mansions, forwarded from the Brazilian interior by a missionary order. The envelope was coarse native paper. Inside was a single photographic print and a brief note in a hand Poirot had not seen for 13 years. The photograph showed an elderly man in a white tropical suit, thinner now, hair snow-white, standing among rows of lush green plants that climbed trellises beneath a blinding sun. Children of every shade surrounded him, laughing, holding up cups as though in toast. On the back, in fountain pen ink already fading, were the words to my friend Hercule Poirot, who kept the greatest secret of my life. The harvest is 1,000-fold. The children you see will never know hemlock fever. Thank you for letting me disappear. R.H. Mission, San Benedito, Rio Madeira, 1938. Poirot studied the photograph a long time. Then he placed it carefully in the tin box beside the pressed flower and returned the box to its drawer. He permitted himself one small, satisfied sigh. The following year the war came, and with it new horrors that made the dilemmas of 1925 seem almost quaint. Yet, even in the blackout, even during the Blitz, packets continued to arrive at the Hawthorne Foundation laboratories in Cambridge. Dried leaves, root cuttings, precise instructions in an anonymous hand. The serum was refined, mass-produced, shipped to field hospitals from Tobruk to Burma. Soldiers who should have died of tropical blood diseases lived. No one ever knew the source. The Foundation simply called it the Brazilian donation. Poirot followed the reports with quiet attention. In 1944, when Hastings returned briefly to London on government business, the two old friends met for dinner at Poirot's flat. Over the tisane and the petit fours, Hastings, sunburnt and cheerful, spoke of his children, of cattle prices, of everything except the past. Only as he was leaving did he pause in the doorway. "By the way, old man," he said, "I saw a notice in the Times last week. Some missionary doctor named Brother Reginald died in Brazil. Saved thousands, they said. Funny thing, the photograph looked rather like— No, of course it couldn't be. Just the light, I suppose." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The light, mon ami, plays many tricks, especially in the tropics." Hastings laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Still the same secretive beggar. Good night, Poirot." "Good night, Hastings." The door closed. Poirot returned to his chair by the fire, took out the tin box one last time and opened it. The pressed flower had crumbled to dust, but the photograph remained, the children's faces bright as ever. He touched the image lightly with one fingertip, as though bestowing a blessing. In 1959, the expected obituary appeared in the British medical journals. Dr. Reginald Hawthorne, presumed deceased 1925, actually living quietly in Brazil since that date. Discoverer of the Yanomoro serum, dead at the age of 89, surrounded by those he had saved. The accompanying photograph was the same one Poirot kept. The world marvelled at the romantic story of a man who had faked his own murder to serve humanity. Conspiracy theories blossomed. Spiritualists claimed contact with the beyond. Journalists besieged Lady Evelyn, now a frail recluse in a Sussex convent, and Clara Beaumont, still nursing in a northern prison hospital, for comment. Both women refused to speak. Only Poirot knew the exact choreography of the illusion. The wax head, the hidden tunnel, the loyal assistant, the final journey south with living plants wrapped in damp moss. Only Poirot had carried the secret for 34 years, guarding it the way a priest guards absolution. On the morning the obituary appeared, he dressed with particular care. The charcoal suit with the faint lilac stripe, the perfectly waxed moustaches, the Malacca cane. He took a taxi to Westminster Cathedral, lit a candle he would never explain, and then travelled on to Cambridge. At the Hawthorne Foundation laboratories, he asked to see Dr. Margaret Leland, now white-haired and venerable herself. She received him in her office overlooking the tranquil backs. "I have come to return something," Poirot said, and laid the faded photograph on her desk. "He wished you to have it." Dr. Leland studied the image, eyes misting. "I always wondered who made the first donation possible. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." He bowed. "Some secrets, Doctor, are heavier than others. This one I am happy at last to lay down." That evening, back in Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot poured his tisane, arranged his cushions, and for the first time in decades, opened the tin box to find it empty. The photograph was gone, the flower dust swept away. He smiled, a small private smile of perfect contentment. Outside, London traffic murmured like a distant sea. Inside, the little Belgian sat very straight, hands folded, eyes closed, listening to a memory of children's laughter beneath a Brazilian sun, and the soft rustle of green leaves that had chosen life for everyone. Somewhere south of the equator, a grave earth settled over a simple wooden cross marked Brother Reginald. But the green that chooses kept growing, climbing, flowering, long after the man who carried it across an ocean had turned to dust. And Hercule Poirot, guardian of the greatest and kindest deception of his career, raised his cup in a silent toast no one saw. "To the perfect crime," he whispered to the quiet room, "the one that saved the world." Then he drank his tisane, turned off the lamp, and went to bed, sleeping more peacefully than he had in 34 years. The doctor's dilemma was ended. The green had chosen, and order, method, and humanity had prevailed after all.